associated with this course, you could download it. Again, on the right-hand side of your screen, there should be a dialog box that says Handouts 1 of 5. If you click the downward arrow on that, you will be able to pick up a PDF version of all the slides we're going to show you this afternoon. You can download it anytime during the presentation, but if you forget and you don't get it or some problem happens, don't worry. Either Katie or I can send it to you at any point. Just send us an email. We'd be happy to do that. We also are recording this training session. We record all of our training sessions. They wind up being housed at the GoToWebinar site, and about 2 hours, 3 hours after we're done here this afternoon, you should be able to view that and go over it again if you like. Now, it is a link that we do have to send you, so if you want to get that link, again, send Katie or I an email, and we'd be happy to send that to you. Let's see, did I forget anything, Katie?
No, I think you got it all covered.
Okay, good. All right, here we go. All right, so the task at hand this afternoon is to go over the material that you see on the screen before you. We're going to be covering these regulations this afternoon: Truck and Bus, Periodic Smoke Inspection Program, the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, Off-Road Regulation, and then Portable Equipment Registration Program. I'm going to be doing the first 3, then Katie's going to come in and do off-road, and then I'll finish up with the Portable Equipment Registration Program. None of these portions are in the full depth that they could be if we were just doing a section on that particular or whichever particular rule it is. This is an overview. That's why it says compliance overview. So we're going to be more or less at a 50,000 foot view. We will go into a lot of details, but there is more available if you would like to see some more information. We can get that for you and give you whatever you need. But today we're going through these. I expect that we should be done somewhere between 3 and 3:30 this afternoon. If you can stay with us the entire time, fantastic. If you get the information that you want, don't feel obligated to stick around. It's entirely up to what your schedule will allow. All right, so first off, I need to give you some background information. We always do this. This is the reason for the season, so to speak. Why do we have these regulations, and why are Katie and I giving the information? Well, the primary focus for most of the regulations we're going to talk about is diesel particulate matter. And the main issue, there's 2 main issues with diesel particulate matter, and one of them is demonstrated on the slide you see before you. The size of the material is incredibly small, and in fact, it's so small, especially when you're talking about PM 2.5, which represents about 95% of what comes out of a diesel engine, all that black soot. It is so small that stuff bypasses your body's normal mechanism for filtration, and it's able to get into the deepest part of your lungs and actually into your bloodstream. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is it has been identified as having many, many toxic materials associated with it. The compounds, the metals, the organic particulates that make up diesel particulate matter are all nasty. You don't want them in your body. So this is the main reason these regulations exist. Now, how do we know we have a problem in California? Whenever somebody asks me that and they ask why our regulations are so strict here, I point out what you're seeing on the screen here now. This is data that's collected by a variety of companies, organizations, agencies that all have air monitoring sites. There are air monitoring sites placed all over the country. Some of them are owned by the federal government, some are state, some are local, some are owned by private enterprise, and it doesn't matter who owns them. Because they're collecting health-related information, that information is considered public. And at some point, it has to be reported to the federal government. Now, I could point you to websites where you can go get that data yourself and take a look and probably fall asleep because it's just numbers. But the kind folks at the American Lung Association have taken upon themselves to, on an annual basis, tabulate the data in such a way that it makes it easy to see where the problems are. So what they do is they take a look at all the data across the country, and they look specifically at the top 300 metropolitan areas across the country. And each of those areas has air monitoring sites. And every time one of those air monitoring sites gets a reading of a substance that we know is harmful, at a level that we know is bad, that location gets a tick mark. And the more tick marks a location gets, the higher up on the lists that they create it goes. So you're looking today here right now at the top 10 worst places in the country to live for particulate matter pollution and ozone pollution based on the data that the American Lung Association tabulates from that air monitoring site catalog. You should be able to tell right away that California is winning this contest. It's we're in first place and second place on particulate matter. We've got 6 of the top 10 worst places for particulate matter. For ozone, we've got the top 6 worst places and 7 of the top 10. This is not a good deal. And if you really wanted to understand why people come to work at the Air Resources Board other than a paycheck, it's because we're trying to fix this problem. California has more people, more industry, and more of a lot of things than most other states in this country. And the pollution that we have is also affecting a larger number of people in such a negative way. So we're here to try and fix this, and these regulations are our attempt to do so. I also want to point out some short-term data that is collected at the same air monitoring sites. There's different ways to collect data and to actually look at it. You can look at it in long-term over a set period of time, but you can also look at it over a 24-hour period. And the reason you look at it in that way is because 24-hour period would be high levels in a very short period of time. They call that an acute exposure. And when you look at it from that standpoint, California has 10 of the top 20 worst places in the country for this short-term particulate pollution. Also very nasty, not something we want to deal with. And again, it's the reason for the season, the reason why we build these regulations and why we have the Air Resources Board, the people working there. All right. This afternoon, I am going to talk about the regulations that I already stipulated, but I want to make sure you're aware that there are other regulations in place. This is a short list, so to speak, of the regulations that have been put out since the year 1998. 1998 was when diesel particulate matter was actually designated as an airborne toxic contaminant, and that's what started all these regulations. So each one of these rules was put in place. You can see the year that they were actually promulgated, and they each have they each cover a particular type of use of diesel engines. You know, for example, urban buses. That was very specific, only dealing with those buses that move people around in urban areas. That was one of the very first things we did. The reason I show you this is not just to point out that there are other regulations, but I want to make sure you're aware that you could have, other than the ones we're going to talk about today, you could have more requirements depending on your particular operation. If you need more information on any of these ones that we are not talking about this afternoon, again, send Katie or I an email, and we'd be happy to send you what information or links that we can. Let's get into the main thrust of the first regulation, the truck and bus. And this is, in my opinion, completely time sensitive. We are in the middle of reporting season for the truck and bus regulation. So hopefully some of you are here this afternoon because you want to know more about what you have to report if you're going to report. The truck and bus regulation is what's called an omnibus rule, which means that there were many other rules that were put in place prior to this one that covered different types of use of diesel engines and vehicles. And the truck and bus regulation was actually created to kind of encapsulate anything that didn't fit into one of the other rules. So it kind of overarchingly covered anything that wasn't already covered. That's why we call it an omnibus rule. So to understand whether or not it applies to you, you first of all have to be a private or a federal fleet with one or more vehicles. Even one vehicle is considered under this regulation. That's considered a fleet. If you operate that vehicle in California and it runs on any form of diesel fuel and has a gross vehicle weight rating of more than 14,000 pounds, you are most likely in this regulation. Public and private school buses also fall under this regulation, although they have very specific requirements that we're not going to cover in this afternoon's class. So if you have questions about those, please let me know, or Katie, and we'll get that information for you. The same could be true or said of two-engine street sweepers. By default, they were put into this regulation, even though the nature of that type of vehicle sometimes should put it in a different one. But they're in here. And private utilities. So there is a separate regulation called the Public Agency and Utility Regulation that private and public utilities have been under until the beginning of this year. January 1st of 2021, any utility that's considered a public utility has to follow the truck and bus rule instead of the utility regulation. All that really means is that there's another step for the private utilities. How do you know if you're private or public? Well, I've had that question a few times from people, and if your company is owned and you can buy stock and you're a utility, you are a private utility. And there are other ways to determine it as well, but that's the main way I usually look at it. All right, so this is who must comply. And I just want to go a little further into the private utilities because that just happened in this year. It's privately owned. It provides a similar service for any other utility that may be operated by a municipality. Telephone companies have never been considered a utility under the regulation, and they generally do have to follow the truck and bus rule. If you're unsure about any of this stuff about private utilities, if we have any private utility people in the audience this afternoon, again, we do have a contact number there, but I would suggest that you either call that number or send Katie or I an email, and we'd be happy to help you out. Responsibility to comply. So first of all, we covered who's under the rule. Now we know that. What is the responsibility to those people that are under this rule? Well, we're going to hold you responsible if you own, lease, rent, sell, or broker the use of any vehicle that falls under this rule. So if you own it, obviously, you're responsible for it. If you lease or rent a vehicle, that's a little tricky for some people, but generally it's going to be such a new vehicle, it's not going to hurt your fleet. So there's a clause in the regulation that says that it has to be stipulated in your contract language who's going to be responsible for it. At this point, we're so far along that most of the rental and lease vehicles are new enough that it really doesn't matter if they're in your fleet or the leasor's fleet. It's not going to hurt you. California-based brokers and dispatchers is a different thing altogether. This creates a possibility where you could have an entity who doesn't even own a vehicle. They've never purchased one of these. They don't run vehicles, but what they do is they contract with owners to move goods and provide service. And if that's you, if your company is hiring other trucks to move material from one place to another in the state of California and you're based in California, then you're considered a broker or dispatcher. And the requirements under this regulation essentially say that you are required to hire compliant vehicles and compliant fleets. If you don't, you can be held to the same regulatory standard, i.e., you could be fined the same if we find a vehicle that is out of compliance and we can determine that you hired it without doing any check to see that they were in compliance. So you have to verify those fleets are in compliance. When you're selling vehicles, this has been a common misconception, but the Air Resources Board does not restrict under this rule, or most of our rules does not restrict anyone from selling any kind of vehicle they want, anytime they want, whenever they want, wherever they want. It's not a restriction on selling a vehicle. The requirement, if you're going to sell vehicles that fall under this regulation, is that you warn the people who are purchasing them, if they're going to operate them in California especially, that the vehicle falls under this regulation. And there's specific language, and it's in that advisory that's listed there, that you can use. It should be on your contract language for any sale. There are always exclusions to any rule, so let's go through the ones for this rule. And I will say that most of the exclusions you're going to see here are common through many of the regulations that we have. Emergency vehicles and emergency use of non-emergency vehicles has kind of a blanket exemption through most of our regulatory programs. As well does tactical military vehicles like that nice Humvee right there. Personal use motorhomes, they were exempted pretty much by fiat at the very beginning of this regulation. There's this line in there that specifically exempts anything for personal use. Even the ones where you have a semi-tractor rig hauling a fifth wheel. If that's its only use, that vehicle would actually be exempt from this regulation. It's a little tougher to actually prove, but there have been ways to do it and people that have done it. So if that's you, or if you know somebody that has a semi-tractor rig and is hauling a fifth wheel, they could certainly get an exemption from this rule because it's personal use and it's a motorhome type deal. Personal use pickup trucks. I'm going to go through the personal use pickup trucks a little bit more in a minute, but basically there was a kind of an issue created by how you define personal use, how you define pickup trucks, first of all, and by the size that they can be. So a personal use pickup truck that is less than or equal to 19,500 pounds gross vehicle weight. First of all, that is a pretty good sized pickup truck right there. And personal use means personal use. So here's where the issue lies. If you don't already know this, every pickup truck from the smallest one to the largest one, whether it's personal use or commercial use, is designated by DMV as a commercial vehicle. Even my little Nissan Frontier pickup truck that I use to go to work and back is a commercial vehicle under DMV's registration system. Because of that, when ARB employees do searches to determine what vehicles are in our state, and we use DMV registration information, we get a list that includes all the vehicles that are considered commercial, because this rule applies to commercial vehicles. And that includes all those pickup trucks, like mine, that run diesel and are over 14,000 pounds. Mine's not over 14, but it includes those vehicles that are. So you've got a whole class of people that are caught up in possibly having regulatory issues. They're certainly going to have issues with registration unless they deal with us on some basis. But the determining factor is whether or not this pickup truck has a pickup bed. You can say it's personal use, and it might well be personal use. But if you have a pickup bed with something other, pickup truck with something other than a standard pickup bed, it could, even if it is personal use, it will still most likely fall under the regulation if it meets all the rest of the conditions. I'll give you an example, and I know I'm going along in the tooth here, but they need to understand this. I met somebody up in Reading a few months ago who is a retired person. As he retired, he purchased the truck of his dreams, which was a Ford F450, which is in the 17 to 18,000 pound gross vehicle weight range. And because he was going to use it on his farm and he wanted some extra capacity and capabilities, instead of having a pickup bed put on it, he had a stake side bed put on it. He also had a Tommy lift put on the back side of it, which, love Tommy lifts. They're very, very useful in many ways. But those two things, even though this vehicle was used for nothing other than his work around his ranch, those two things put his vehicle into this regulation. And, it's not a good thing, but it is, we don't have a way of excising that kind of vehicle when it has commercial type equipment associated with it. Anyway, if you have problems like that, we do have a way to help you out. We'll talk about that in just a second. Historic vehicles also have some an exemption under this rule. You have to understand a historic vehicle has to be registered that way through DMV. And the kind of vehicle we're talking about are trucks like the one you see pictured there, which are all nice and chromed up and are usually show vehicles. They have other restrictions on what they can, how many miles they can drive and what they can haul, if anything. But again, for our purposes, it has to be registered as historic in order for it to get this exemption. And finally, vehicles that are subject to any other in-use regulations. So one of the rules that was on that list that I showed you a few moments ago was the drayage truck regulation. That would be any truck that hauls containers in and out of ports or rail yards. And because they're hauling containers, they fall under a rule that's specific to drayage trucks, because that's what a drayage truck is defined as. So because they're under that regulation, they're not covered by this one. So they're exempt from this one, at least for the time being, but it doesn't mean they're not regulated. Okay. All right. So I told you I'd give you some information on the pickup truck. This page right here shows you something we call EDVR, which EDVR is short for the Excluded Diesel Vehicle Reporting System. It is a reporting system that we created specifically to have the ability for people with those pickup trucks that are going to get caught up in our system but are personal use, for them to come in and to report and to give us information so that we can exclude them from the actual requirements. If you need that, there it is. It's in your handout and it's right there.
Hey, Randy.
Yes.
We had a good question come through, so I just want to highlight it to the class. But they asked if an on-road diesel vehicle with greater than 14,000 GVWR with an engine that doesn't run, if that's still subject to the rule.
Okay, so let me go back a slide. Go back, not forward. And I'm glad this was showing up. I don't know that this is the case for this particular person's question, but it makes me think of this situation. I know a few people who have trucks that they have setting out in front of their locations, their business, that are monikers for their business, or they have a truck that they've retired for some reason that's just sitting in the yard somewhere, and it's not registered, or it's registered as non-operable or something of that nature. The problem we have with those is that even if it's registered as non-op, even if it's sitting in front of your business, the technicality is that it most likely falls under the regulations. So if it's over 14,000 pounds and it has a diesel engine, whether you use it or not, or whether or not it can run, you will get caught up in this regulation. How do you get out of this regulation? Well, if it has no engine, that we can exclude that. If it has an engine that doesn't work, we're not going to come out to your place of work and try and verify that. So what I would suggest is, well, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. One of them's easier than the other, but one of them works better. So the one that works better, in my opinion, is to designate that vehicle as low use. If it doesn't have a functioning engine, I'm guessing it doesn't move. If it doesn't move, it's going to not have any miles put on it. So the low use exemption, which I'll talk about more later, allows for 1,000 miles of operation of any vehicle that falls under this rule, and it exempts you from having to upgrade that vehicle. If you have a vehicle that is not going to go more than 1,000 miles in California in a year, like one that has an engine not functioning, I would tell you one of your options is to register it as a low use. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. The only issue that's going to come up is if it's listed as non-op with DMV, or if it happens to be in an area where we do some kind of inspection or audit and we see a vehicle that is under the rule and isn't reported or registered as being in the rule, then it could create some problems. And I don't want people to go through the type of work that's necessary to get those things taken care of. So that was a long answer, but basically a truck like that would fall under this rule, but there are ways to keep it from having you to have to do anything to upgrade the piece of equipment. And Katie brought up something that I forgot to point out at the very beginning. When you have questions, and some of you have already figured this out, the questions dialog box on the right-hand side, one of the reasons that is there is while I'm talking, Katie is monitoring that. When you have questions, she's going to try and answer them offline so I can go through this material. If something comes up like this last question that was important enough and a good enough question that it needed to be brought to the attention of the entire class, she's, like she did, she's going to stop me and she's going to read that question for everybody. I will do the same thing for her when she's conducting the off-road training.
Randy, there's a quick follow-up for that one too. So this vehicle only has an hour meter. It doesn't have an odometer.
Okay, well, if they want to get it under the low use exemption, it has to have some type of mechanism for measuring mileage, not hours. In that case, I would suggest you put a hub meter on there. And that's an added expense. I realize that, but that's less of an expense than what the ticket would cost or the fine would cost if it wound up being under audit or inspection. So there has to be some way of reporting mileage, not hours, under this regulation. Under the off-road, it would be hours, but for on-road, it's always mileage. Okay, so we've talked about what vehicles fall under this rule. We've talked about who's responsible for their compliance, but now we have to get into what the actual requirements are. And I do have one more thing we have to classify or figure out before I can tell you what your requirements are. Because this rule is bifurcated into two different types of requirements, and it's based upon the size of the vehicle. So we classify all trucks over 14,000 pounds diesel California that are in this rule as either a light truck or a heavy truck. A light truck, if you want to go with industry standards, is a class 4, 5, or 6 truck. It's anything that weighs at least 14,001 pounds, but no more than 26,000 pounds. These are your simple box trucks or other type trucks that just aren't giant vehicles. And then the heavy trucks are all the full size, the big semi-tractor rigs that are going to have, pull trailers and buses and things like that. Anything over 26,000 pounds. You have to know which size your vehicle is before I can tell you what your requirement is. Now, where do you get this information? Easy enough. Most vehicles, probably better than 90% of them, are going to have a tag like the one shown on the left on the inside driver's door jamb, because the manufacturer of that piece of equipment is required to put a tag like that somewhere on the vehicle. Even if it's a glider kit where you're building a vehicle and using different engines and chassis and putting your kind of, equipment together the way you want, the person or company building that particular truck is supposed to put some type of tag like this. One of the numbers on this tag, like I've got it circled in red there, should say something like gross weight or GVW or GVWR, or it might even spell out gross vehicle weight rating. Any of those are acceptable. You'll also notice that there will be other numbers on that tag, because it'll list different weights for different purposes. An ARV inspector doesn't care about any of those other numbers. They want just the gross weight. If you're putting information into our reporting system, we just want the gross weight. The other number that you're going to need to find is also the model year of the engine. So the reason we want the model year of the engine is because all engines are certified for sale in the United States by the federal EPA. And they're certified, on-road engines are certified by model year. So that is how this rule was written, is by model year. So all the requirements are based on the weight of the truck and what the model year of the engine is. Don't rely upon the model year of the truck, because generally that is going to be the chassis model year and not necessarily the engine's model year. We've had a lot of different problems with people who think, oh, I've got a 2010 truck, and it turns out they've got a 2008 engine. That's a big deal. You need to know that information. Now, where do you get that information? Well, there's a picture right there of a tag that is legally required to be on all engines, all on-road diesel engines over 6,000 pounds that were manufactured since 1974. All those engines are supposed to have a tag like this on them, which gives you the model year of the engine, specifically listed out. And I know you have a bunch of tags on these engines, but the right one will almost always, and I'm going to say almost only because I know they exist, but I've never seen one that didn't say this. All these tags that I've ever seen have one phrase at the top, and they say important engine information. If you see that moniker, that label at the top of the tag, that is the right label. So that's where you find the model year of the engine. Now, since we have the weight class and we have the model year of the engine, I can now tell you what your requirement is. So we'll start with the light engines, or the light vehicles. The light vehicles have a little bit easier to read way to determine what your requirement is, because there's just one requirement. First thing you have to do is find your model year engine. So on the left-hand side of this chart, this is for all light trucks, class 4, 5, and 6 under the rule. You have to find the model year engine on the left, and then a year or date on the right. Whatever that date is when that vehicle's engine has to meet 2010 model year emission standards. That's confusing for some people because they don't know how you meet 2010 model year emission standards. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, the only way you can meet 2010 emission standards is with a 2010 or newer engine. There is no retrofit that you can stick on an old engine to make it 2010 compliant. It has to be repowered. So the choice, if you have a vehicle in this class and you're up to the date where it has to be swapped out, you either have to repower that to get it to 2010, or you have to retire it, or you have to replace it, or you have to drop it down into low use. So all those people, perhaps some of you in the audience today, that have these light trucks that have a 2003 up to and including 2006 model year engine, on January 1st of this year, you had to have a 2010 or newer engine in that thing. Otherwise, it's not legal to drive in the state of California. Right, so that's the requirement. If you follow this chart, there is no reporting required. You don't have to put your information in our truckers reporting system. Most people do anyway, but you don't have to if you're following this chart. Okay, that was for light vehicles. Let's take a look at heavy vehicles. It's a very similar chart. There's only one difference, and it's a major difference. It's that in the middle of this particular chart, there was a requirement to also have what's called a diesel particulate filter installed by a particular date, depending on the model year of your engine. So let's use that same class, the 2000 to 2004 engine model year. If you had a heavy vehicle over 26,000 pounds, class 7 or 8, that had a 2002 engine in it, you were supposed to legally have a filtration system installed on that piece of equipment by January 1st, 2013, in order to be legal to operate until January 1st of this year. And then January 1st of this year, even if you had the filter, that engine still has to meet 2010 emission standards. And again, the only way to do that is to repower. So the filter doesn't do you any good by itself. It has to be repowered. If you meet the terms of this regulation, again, there's no reporting required. For most people, that end date on the right is going to mean one of two things. You're either dropping the vehicle down to a low-use exemption, again, which we'll talk about more later, or you're retiring the vehicle, somehow just getting rid of the vehicle. The repower option is available. Most dealerships will do that service, but it's also an extremely expensive service, and it would probably cost more to do than the engine is actually worth. Okay, so let's take a look at what's next here. This rule has had a few what are called flexibility options. I hesitate to go too deep into this because most of them are not in existence anymore. We're almost to the point where this rule is fully implemented, but along the way we did have ways for people to basically step outside the boxes I just showed you. They were flexibilities that allowed you to operate longer without filters or longer without converting the engine to 2010 if you met certain conditions. Now, like I said, most of those have already passed, but we did have a little bit of a hiccup. You know, back in 2014, under duress from the public and our legislature, the Air Resources Board actually modified the truck and bus rule, and we added some flexibilities. We extended some flexibilities, and we gave people more time and more options. And immediately after we promulgated these changes, we were sued by a company called Lawson Trucking. Now, Lawson Trucking, in conjunction with the California Trucking Association, filed a lawsuit saying that the changes were created an unfair business advantage to the people who didn't have to update their vehicles. And basically the argument was Lawson and CTA's members had already purchased new vehicles, had already put filters on, and they had paid the money to comply with our rule. And then we were giving everybody else a chance to not have to do that. I agree with that line of thinking, but I also agreed with having the new flexibilities in the rule. But that didn't matter. We got sued and we lost the case. So all the changes that we made in 2014 actually were thrown out. And we put off by filing another legal document contesting that lawsuit. We put off any decision until 2018. And in 2018, the administrative judge came back and told us we'd lost. So the 2014 amendments that we put in place are no more. For most people, that doesn't have any impact because most people who took advantage of any of the changes we made in 2014 were able to get them and use them because they were ending typically in 2018 anyway. But there are a few things that did change that caused some people a little bit more of a larger impact. And I'm going to talk briefly about these options because there were some changes under the lawsuit, and these options still do exist. First one is heavy cranes. This was a flexibility option that did not exist prior to the 2014 amendments. And essentially it's for, and I didn't even know what kind of vehicles these were until I read up about this, but these are giant on-road cranes that do nothing but crane work and have to have a certified crane operator run the crane. They don't have any ability to haul cargo. They have to be more than 54,000 pounds gross weight. So these are giant pieces of equipment. And I know some of you have seen these. If you've ever seen one of those trucks sitting out in the parking lot with a crane extension that goes up 250 feet or something like that. That's a heavy crane, and those vehicles were covered by this flexibility. And then when the lawsuit happened, the flexibility was taken away. So what we did is we installed that flexibility in another completely different regulation. It's now in the solid waste collection vehicle rule. So the people that were under that flexibility are still following it, and technically they're not in the truck and bus rule, but in all intents and purposes, they are still following the same program. So if you do have a vehicle like this and you believe that it's a heavy crane and you don't know that you're already in the heavy crane option, you need to contact our office, because that vehicle is technically supposed to be in this regardless of whether you wanted it to be in this or not. Ag vehicles did have a pretty big change because of the lawsuit. When we made the amendments, we gave more mileage and time for the ag operators to run their trucks, and because of the lawsuit basically making those changes invalid, we had a situation where for 1 year, and that was 2019, anybody under the ag provision, with trucks under the ag provision, actually lost 5,000 miles of operation in 2019. Beyond that, there were no significantly big impacts unless you had cattle trucks, because cattle trucks were something that was put under the 2014 amendments and then taken back out after the lawsuit. For anybody that's operating ag vehicles right now, you still have the mileage limitation, you still have a reporting requirement, you still have all the options that the provision offers, but your mileage right now is no more than 10,000 miles per year per vehicle, and that ends in 2023, January 1st of 2023. At that point, you could drop that vehicle down to low use, but your requirement is to ultimately replace the vehicle with one that has a 2010 or newer model year engine. Here's one that I think is going to be around for a while, at least I hope it will be. This one is related to the fact that when we were putting this rule together, one of the reasons that this rule is in place is because we're trying to meet federal guidelines on different pollutants that we have in our air. One of the pollutants is oxides of nitrogen, which is a component of photochemical smog, or ozone. And when we were looking at the data, we saw that there were several counties in the state of California that were actually in compliance with federal standards for NOx. So for those counties, we never really needed to get any improvement in NOx. And as a consequence, or I guess I used that word twice, but because of that, if you live and work in any one of the dark green counties on this map, the rule does not require you to go beyond a filter on the truck. You still have to get the same filter that I was talking about a few moments ago, but once you're filtered, you're more or less done with this regulation. I say more or less because there's still a reporting requirement on an annual basis, and if you pick up a new truck for your fleet, it has to have a filter, otherwise you can't put it under this option. But once you get that filter, you're done with having to do anything to the vehicle as long as you own that vehicle. You cannot go outside the geographic areas designated by the dark green shaded counties, and there is no mileage limitation. So it's a pretty good option if that's where you live and that's where you work. The only reason I put it in this section of this presentation, and the only reason that there are gray shaded counties, is because the 2014 amendments added those counties, and because of the lawsuit, they got taken back out. Anyway, this option is still available for anybody that wants to use it. It does not have an end date, so as long as you filter your truck and you keep reporting properly, unless something else comes up, you should be able to run that vehicle for an extended period of time. We also have a issue in the rule with trucks that have problems getting filtration, or trucks that were filtered by a specific date. So there were two things happening here. One was the fact that in the original writing of the rule, we stipulated that any fleet that filtered all of their trucks before January 1st or by January 1st of 2014, we were going to give an extension to all those trucks until 2023. So there's still some of those around. When we rewrote the rule in 2014, we took away the fact that it had to be all of your fleet. And again, the lawsuit brought that back. So that's still in the rule. If you are an owner-operator and you own the truck that you had back in 2014 and you put a filter on it and you were the one that did that, then you should qualify for this extension regardless of what the model year of the engine is. You just need to make sure you get a hold of our trucker staff and provide them with the proof that, all that's true. The other part of this extended use of filters, or this filter issue, is that there was a provision in the rule that called for a manufacturer's delay, and it's still there. I don't know why too many people would be putting filters on unless they're doing the low NOx thing, but if you are in the market for putting a filter on and you're worried about meeting the terms of this regulation, what I would suggest that you do is get in process of the installation of the filter by September 1st of the year before you're required to have it. Because that September 1st deadline is, if you are in contract, money down, 10% down, to have a filter installation by September 1st, even if the filter does not get installed by January 1st because of filter manufacturer delays, then you're still considered compliant. This also is true if you're purchasing a new truck to meet the terms of this regulation. You just need to make sure you contact the trucker staff and it gets put into the reporting system properly. All right, low use exemption. This will be fairly quick, but it's also fairly important. There has been a low use exemption in this rule from the very beginning, and it basically states that any truck that you can keep under 1,000 miles and under 100 hours of stationary operation in the state of California, as long as it's reported properly, is exempt from this regulation, which means you would never have to install a filter on it and you would never have to update to 2010 engines. If you have a vehicle that is timing out, this is an option for you to use, at least temporarily, to keep the vehicle while you figure out what you want to do with it. There's no limitation on the number of low-use vehicles you can have, and there's no limitation, if you have vehicles that are being used for any emergency purpose whatsoever, then any of that use is exempt from this limitation. So I've actually run into a few people that started companies because of this, where they buy a bunch of old vehicles and they hire them out to CAL FIRE and Department of Forestry, and they're used as water tenders, and they've run businesses. Those are emergency use, and those vehicles are exempt. Any of the miles they drive while they're doing that service are exempt from this limitation. So be aware that if you decide you're going to put a vehicle into the low use exemption, we're going to ask you for information to prove that that it's truly low use. We've had people who have had vehicles that were never reported, they never put filters on them, and we finally found those through DMV registration, and then we send them nastygrams saying this vehicle's out of compliance, and they want to put them into low use. But when we ask for data to show that they've been low use since the day they were supposed to have a filter, they have difficulty providing that information. So it can be a problem. And I would suggest that if you have a vehicle that you want to do this with, just make sure that you have background information on the use of that vehicle for the time period that you're trying to designate it as low use. And it may require you to submit pictures of the odometer or documentation like that shows mileages at certain times, so that we can actually designate it as low use in the system. And once you get it designated, you do have to come back in on an annual basis and renew that. But we're going to go through that right now because the reporting period is now. The truckers reporting system, which truckers is just an acronym that's short for Truck Regulation Upload Compliance and Reporting System. We have to make our acronyms spell things. I don't really understand that, but that's what it is. This is an online system where if you need to report, you have to do it this time of year each year. So the month of January is when it's open for doing anything you need to your fleet. It typically opens up in sometime late December, and we will keep it open through February, maybe even into March, depending on whether or not our staff is working with people who have been trying to get in there. If you report anytime after January 31st, technically you're considered as late reported, but we could probably still work that out with you. Anyway, it's open now. You can get there in a number of different ways. Perhaps one of the best ways is just going to this website. This is the truck stop. And if you look at the very top of just below the web address there, you can see yellow highlights says truckers. If you click on that, it takes you directly to the truck regulation reporting system, the truck and bus reporting system. And this is the entry portal. This is where you can create an account or log into your existing account. There's also some resources here. There's also links if you've forgotten your username and password where you can try and recover that information. But this is how you get in. This is where it is. The main reason most people want to report is to get this, okay? This is a certificate of reported compliance. We talked about it a little bit, well, I don't think I actually mentioned it, but when I was talking about brokers and dispatchers early on in this presentation, I said if you're a broker or dispatcher and you're hiring somebody to move something with their truck in California, you needed to demonstrate that you'd asked them that they were in compliance. Some of you are probably thinking, well, how do I do that? This is a way to do that. If you ask them for their certificate, you have done your due diligence. Now, the certificate is not a guarantee that they're in compliance, but it is due diligence that you've asked them that they're in compliance. And the certificate itself, you can only legally get one of these if your fleet is in the truckers reporting system, it is in compliance as reported, and you have agreed to a legal disclaimer that says you're telling us the truth. Once you do all that, you can print the certificate out, and there you go. Anyway, these certificates are only good for a year. You have to come back in each year and renew whatever provision it is that you're trying to get and keep. And each year you have to get a new certificate. All right, so I do need to talk briefly about something called Senate Bill number 1. It's actually not fairly old. It's an older rule now. It's 3 years old now, just about. This is a regulation that was passed when Jerry Brown was governor back in 2017. And some of you may not recognize this name, but know it by another name. It was the gas tax bill. So the long form of this is the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017. It actually had two functions. One was to create the gas tax for fixing roads. I'm not going to talk about that here because that's not part of our agency's purview, but there are people that can talk to you about that. The part that concerns the Air Resources Board and concerns anybody with a vehicle in the truck and bus rule is the road repair, the accountability side of this. Basically what the accountability part of this regulation did is it connects DMV registration to compliance with the truck and bus rule. You have to be in compliance, your truck has to be in compliance, your fleet has to be in compliance with the truck and bus rule in order for it to be registered to operate in the state of California. And you may not even know this is part of the deal until you get a notification from DMV saying your vehicle will not be registered because of this. And that's when you start dealing with our trucker staff, and they can work out, basically what the issue is. We started doing this in 2020, so it's been going, we actually started doing it before that, but it actually came into effect in 2020, and it will be in effect from now on. Also, this is a model that I think, in my opinion, is going to be pretty common for any rules that we have, coming up. I will be talking about another one in just a minute, but basically, if we have a regulation and on a type of vehicle that requires DMV registration, there's a likelihood that there's going to be a connection between those two, so that you have to be in compliance in order to get the vehicle registered. If you're wondering why that is, it is a way to do enforcement without having field enforcement. So it makes it more complete compliance with these regulations when we can tie those two things together. All right. Oh, by the way, If you have a vehicle that is 2011 or newer, you're not going to have a problem with this whole SB1 thing, at least not for the time being, because the DMV database will recognize that 2011 or newer truck as having a 2010 or newer engine. And as a consequence, it will not, they will not send you notifications, or they should not send you notifications that you have a registration issue. If you do think you have issues, though, we do have some contact information. There's an email and a hotline that you can call. We've got people on call every day during the week who will answer your questions and try and connect you with somebody that can actually work out the issues that you're dealing with. We also have webpage information for you if you have the desire to go look at more information about each particular regulation. This happens to be the truck and bus regulation webpage, and there's lots of links with lots of information, fact sheets, resources, regulatory documents, all kinds of good stuff. All right, that was the truck and bus rule and the SB1. Let's talk about PSIP, or Periodic Smoke Inspection Program. First thing you need to be aware with this is that it is a completely separate rule from any of the other ones. It's been in place for longer than pretty much any diesel on-road truck rule that we have. It was first put in place back in 1998, and it's also what's called an in-use rule. So briefly to explain that, the truck and bus rule essentially says your model year of this truck has to have this. But the truck and bus rule doesn't say anything about the emissions of the vehicle going forward after you meet the basic terms of compliance. So you've put a filter on the truck, or so you have a 2010 engine. What if you're the kind of person that doesn't take care of your vehicles and those engines wind up spewing out a bunch of pollution? Well, the only way we can take care of that regulatory-wise is to create an in-use requirement, which that's what this is, where it requires you to do tests on certain vehicles on an annual basis to make sure that you're keeping the maintenance up and that the pollution levels are still staying low. So this particular test that's required it goes by many different names depending on who's doing it and who's telling you what it is. If it's being conducted by ARB inspectors, it's called the Heavy Duty Vehicle Inspection Program. If it's one that's conducted by the owner of the vehicle, it's called the Periodic Smoke Inspection Program. They're the exact same test. If you ask somebody what this test is, they might call it a snap acceleration test. They might call it a snap idle test. They might call it a smoke test for diesel vehicles. Excuse me. They might call it a smog check for diesel vehicles. It goes by a lot of other names as well. But essentially, it is a smog test. And it applies to you, the periodic one applies to you if you have 2 or more California-based vehicles with a gross weight of more than 6,000 pounds and an engine model year older than 4 years. So let's do a couple of examples. Let's say I have a single truck and it's over 6,000 pounds and it's running diesel. Am I part of this program? The answer is no. All right, the answer is no. I only have 1. I don't have 2. Well, let's say I have 2, but one of them is brand new. Its engine is not older than 4 years. So let's go down the line. I have 2, so I meet that. They're over 6,000 pounds, so I'm in. I am in the program. I don't have to test the new one until its engine is 4 years old. I have to test the old one going forward, right? If I have 20 vehicles, obviously I'm in this. So that means every year I have to test each one of those vehicles. There are no exemptions from this limitation or this regulation. So even emergency vehicles are required to be tested. There are some other limitations related to this in harbors and things like that, places like that you might also want to be aware of where this applies. But it's simply what's called an opacity test. And an opacity is a measurement of the level of black smoke coming from the exhaust. The more black smoke, the higher the opacity. Now, you may be wondering why I'm talking about it now. Well, because this rule's been around so long that when we originally put it in place, we had engines that were putting out a lot of pollution. It was before filtration systems were actually available for most engines. and the opacity levels allowed under the old rule were significantly high. You can see them right there. We had to lower the opacity levels that were required by this regulation because of the advent of filtration systems. Diesel particulate filters should remove 99.9% of all the soot coming from diesel engines, and so the 40 and 50% opacities just didn't make sense anymore. So we lowered those. While we were getting into the rule, we also added smoke tester training requirements that were not in there before, and created a voluntary program, which I'll talk about in just a moment, and as long as we were doing that. So the new opacity levels that are set by this law are shown here. The basic one is this. If you're required to do this test and you test one of your vehicles, the opacity has to be no more than 5% or the vehicle fails, if that vehicle has a filter. If it doesn't have a filter, and that could be your low-use vehicles or ag vehicles or something like that wouldn't necessarily have a filter on them yet or at all, there are still lower opacity levels than there were under the previous regulation, but they're shown there and they're based on the model year of the engine that you have. There are also some specialized pieces of equipment that are listed here that have trouble getting down to the low opacity level, so they're given a higher level as well. As far as the training requirements are concerned, there's really two types of people that can conduct this test. One is the owner of the vehicle, if they have the proper equipment to do the test, and the other would be somebody that you hire who has equipment to do the test. If you hire somebody, that smoke tester is required to attend a training class that's held at community colleges located throughout the state of California that are part of something called the CDET program. CDET is essentially community colleges that have diesel mechanic schools, and there are 8 of them that are certified to provide this training throughout the state of California. I think there's 1 in Sacramento, 1 in Stockton, 2 in the Bay Area, 2 in Los Angeles area, and 2 in the San Diego area. In any case, that person who's charging you to conduct the test is required to have attended a 1-day certification class to actually do that test. With COVID concerns, they have moved that to an online type training, but they still have to have the training once every 4 years. So if I'm hiring somebody to do this test for me, one of the things I'm going to do is ask them for the certificate from the CDET program and make sure that it is not more than 4 years old. If it is, or they don't have it, it's an invalid test regardless of what kind of equipment they have. So that was one person that can do the test. The other person that can do the test is either the owner of the truck or somebody that works for their fleet. We're not requiring that person to actually go to the CDET training program, but there is now an online training class that anybody conducting a test on their own vehicles or their own fleet is required to have attained or trained. It is a couple hours. It's online. It's menu driven. You go through, you watch these little videos, you answer some questions, and as long as you get a 70% or better throughout the thing, through all the modules, you pass, and you will be sent a certificate as well as a tester number that has to be entered into the testing device. The record keeping and reporting requirements really haven't changed, especially the record keeping requirements. It's always been you have to retain records of these opacity tests for 2 years. And as long as you do that, we don't have a reporting system for those opacity records. It's the only time that they ever are something that ARB personnel want to see is if we're auditing your fleet for some reason. So if we're auditing your fleet to try and get you into the truck and bus rule as a low-use vehicle or ag vehicle or whatever the case is, then we're probably going to ask you for current opacity readings. So we need to see that data. If you're under audit from our enforcement division, they're going to want to see 2 years worth of opacity readings for the vehicles that are in the fleets. and that's what it was before. We did add an additional voluntary choice for people who have newer vehicles. So anybody that has a truck or trucks that fall under this rule where the engines are 2013 model year and newer, those vehicles are equipped with something called onboard diagnostics, or OBD. Basically, it's the computer system that your vehicles have run on for a long time, except now it's in the heavy-duty vehicle class. These vehicles are capable of having smog inspections done to them because there's a little dongle underneath the steering column that the computer can attach to. If you have one of those vehicles, you can choose to download a file using that computer input and then submit it to us on this reporting system that's linked here. It would be required to submit if you're going to go that way. If you just want to do the actual test using the old style, that's fine. You just keep the record. But if you're going to use the new style, then there is a requirement to report on an annual basis. I also need to let you know that we're in the process of putting together a new type of smog inspection. So right now it's actually passed, but we're working on the details of how to actually do what's called an inspection and maintenance program on heavy-duty vehicles, heavy-duty diesel vehicles. If you don't know what inspection and maintenance means, the quick and dirty for that is smog check. Right now you have an inspection and maintenance program for your gasoline vehicles throughout the state of California. That is a smog check. There will be one in short order for diesel vehicles. It should be fully instituted by 2023 or sometime in 2023. So look for that to happen. And when that happens, the PSIP test is probably going to go away for most people because you're going to be part of this new IMM program. All right. So before I turn this over to Katie, I do want to talk about the newest stuff. Everything I've hit so far has been in place or has been part of older type regulations or the older style of regulations, all dealing with combustion vehicles and combustion technology. In the state of California, we have, as I showed you very early, such a problem with pollutants, though. We are transitioning to mostly electric or hybrid electric or zero emission type vehicles. In that vein, we have actually passed 2 different regulations already that are going that direction. The first was something called the Advanced Clean Trucks, and it was more of a regulation to gather information, excuse me, than anything else, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And shortly thereafter, we passed something called the Low NOx Omnibus, which is going to make sure that the combustion vehicles run as low NOx as possible. The next regulation after the Low NOx Omnibus is going to be a zero emission or zero emission fleet type rules, which are going to require the transitioning of diesel vehicles and gas vehicles to zero emission. For the Advanced Clean Truck summary, it had 2 basic elements. The first element was a sales requirement for the manufacturers of vehicles sold in these weight classes in the state of California. The second, and it's actually going to come up first, even though it's the second part of this regulation, was large entity reporting. So there's a one-time reporting requirement for any vehicles, facilities, contracted vehicles, if you contract vehicle services, and this applies to larger companies as well as all government agencies. The requirement is actually supposed to be April of 2021. So we're 4 months away from when this thing is supposed to actually happen. And if you don't know that that's there, we're still working, Katie and I, or Katie more than me, but we're working on a training program for the reporting component of this. And